listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889. Thank you for listening to Community Forum. My name is Johnny Chandler. I'm the owner of KCCC 930 AM and the host of Community Forum. With me today, a repeated guest, is Paul Gessing. Paul Gessing is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Welcome back, sir.
Hey, good to be back with you, Johnny.
Definitely glad you're here. Thank you for keeping us updated on all states, all matters in the state, especially when it comes to what's happening in Santa Fe. I know you always have a list of items and an agenda of things you want to inform us about down here. So we're just going to kind of kick it off and let you lead the way as normal. So what, out of the issues you want to talk about today in our 30-minute segment, what do you think is, what would you like to start with?
Oh, of course. The issue of Southeast New Mexico potentially, although not likely, seceding from the rest of the states. And that story, while politically and simply put, it's not going to happen anytime soon, it does bring a lot of attention on the issue and the concerns and problems that I think a lot of folks in Southeastern New Mexico have with the way business is carried out in Santa Fe. And also just how important, at least financially, Southeast New Mexico is to the rest of the state. And, it's caught some attention from, for example, the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives said he's going to form a study group, a task force, essentially. There was an article written in the Santa Fe New Mexican by the editor of the New Mexican saying, well, New Mexico should consider annexing El Paso, which he said was more culturally similar to New Mexico. I didn't get an impression, or he didn't say whether it was some kind of quid pro quo or a trade kind of thing. But there's just a lot of talk about this particular issue of New Mexico's southeastern part being disenchanted, and I think rightfully so. And of course, this all dates back to, I think we may have talked about it on a previous episode, Randy Pettigrew, Jimmy Mason, two representatives from that area of New Mexico, introducing a constitutional amendment to create a process under which some counties, indeterminate as to who, but I think Lea and Eddy are the two most likely to consider moving out of New Mexico. It's not necessarily contemplated whether they would automatically join Texas or anything like that. But yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to get into it, there's also some, before New Mexico was actually a state, and even maybe before Texas was a state. I don't know the exact time frame, so forgive me on that. But the Texas map used to bleed way in all the way to the Rio Grande Mountains, right, all the way to the Rio Grande River. So historically, there are some maps that show that Texas was, much larger than it is currently now, as well as the whole eastern part of the state being a part of Texas at one point. Doesn't mean just because historically you had a map that showed it used to be Texas means it can all of a sudden be Texas. That could have implications wide-ranging all across the country, and then many wars are fought over that all over the world as well. So I'm not sure that that's the right move. But living in Albuquerque for 20 years and then moving down here for the past 4, it'll be 5 years in September. It's obviously a lot different. And then it also, you can just, being a resident down here, just feels like they take the money and then they don't really care about you. So that feeling is pervasive and prevalent. And since I've experienced both, it's pretty obvious. And I assume that you read Jeff Tucker's editorial in the Albuquerque Journal on Sunday related to that. And he had a really interesting angle on methane gas emissions, right? If the state of New Mexico wants to say they were able to get rid of methane gas, they can just get rid of our 2 counties and give them to Texas, and then they can meet almost all of their goals, is what he was claiming.
Yeah, there's so many facts and so much history here, and you touched on some of it. Let me do a little bit more of that. First and foremost, this kind of thing, while talked about a lot in modern politics, is not something that's happened in the past very often. In fact, the only time a group of counties has seceded from the state that they were in was during the Civil War, and that was West Virginia. The mountain folk essentially saying, the folks in the other parts of Virginia, who were obviously in secession, that was not a group that they wanted to continue along with. So they became their own state. But if your one-off time of something happening in American politics is during the Civil War, that's a pretty good indication that it's not likely to happen very often outside of some of those very unique circumstances. And you're right, the map of Texas has been bigger over the years. Of course, it was a territory. They declared independence from Mexico before New Mexico was a state. There's a lot of animosity, quite frankly. I don't know about in the Carlsbad area, but a lot of the traditional Hispanic population and a lot of New Mexicans generally have a distaste for Texas. Now, that is all historical reality. The reality I look at is that Lea and Eddy County are the two biggest oil producing counties in the entire country. They obviously happen to be part of New Mexico. And I agree with you also that they are not treated fairly and not represented by the rest of the state. A big part of that is just sheer numbers. While they generate the revenue for the state of New Mexico, more than half, they are a small fraction of the population, and that population is much more of the progressive left-wing variety, and they basically ignore Southeast New Mexico and its interests. So the reactions that we got from our politicians were, one, the governor of New Mexico said, yeah, the methane comments. Well, methane is a problem around the planet. I don't know how serious it is, but for that to be the governor's big argument in favor of staying in New Mexico is we have cut our methane production. Let's be real, outside of the card carrying members of the Sierra Club and various environmental groups, nobody really cares dramatically about that. Then Speaker Javier Martinez put his 2 cents in and said that the Texas House Speaker should touch grass and that he should fight against Trump more. Well, that we could have a whole conversation about Donald Trump and the politics at the federal level, but this really has nothing to do with Trump or his administration of the federal government, aside from the fact that ultimately somebody in Washington would have to give their blessing to this kind of change. What I think is more relevant is, are the folks in Southeast New Mexico correct? Would they be better off in the state of Texas than in New Mexico? And I think it's easy to see, yes. And, we go through these studies constantly, but it's pretty consistent. Texas is among the fastest growing, most economically free states. Yes, they have high property taxes. They don't have an income tax. But according to the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom in North America Index, Texas is fourth best. New Mexico is dead last. Wallet Hub, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes in more detail, but Wallet Hub did a taxpayer return on investment index recently. Texas is ranked 13th. New Mexico's dead last. The tax structure, of course, I mentioned. Texas is also right to work. Texas is the home to numerous Fortune 500 companies. Basically, New Mexico's economy is oil and gas and federal government. Texas's education system is at least in the middle of the pack. New Mexico is dead last in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So those are just a few reasons why Texas would be an attractive destination for these counties in Southeast New Mexico. But I agree with you. A big part of it is just the attitude, the high-handed attitude. So I reminded folks in a blog post I wrote up about this, about Mimi Stewart, the state senator here in Albuquerque, where in I think 2021, she basically told the Texas counties that were frustrated by the situation, just go ahead and leave. That was her mindset. And that approach, I get it. I understand why they are going to say things like that, because these are hard left progressives who don't really care what Southeast New Mexico has to say. But they should be a little less, uh, kind of dismissive of the area of New Mexico that truly pays the bills for the rest of the state.
I would say that I feel like that would it was a good headline, right? It's a good news story. It's fun to talk about. It's an eat low hanging fruit for the major local media markets in Albuquerque to talk about. It gets eyeballs and readership. But I would say that that would have been a prime opportunity when this gained some notoriety, when it was in the news cycle for a week, right? It absolutely would have been a really great opportunity for the leadership in Santa Fe to kind of turn around and talk about how valued Southeast New Mexico is to the state, right? Beyond the idea of how much revenue this state brings in, or these counties bring into the state. And also, you can just look at the state of New Mexico. If it wasn't for the national labs in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque and Los Alamos, almost all of the economic viability in the state of New Mexico comes from southern New Mexico. I would say much more than northern New Mexico. That's a pretty obvious point. So I thought that was a real opportunity for our leadership in Santa Fe to understand and to cherish and tell everybody how much they appreciate Southeast New Mexico, everything that Southeast New Mexico has to offer. On top of, and the culture is very different than Albuquerque. Living there for 20 years is a very different culture. And to really show people in Southeast New Mexico that they care and they cherish us, right? Not to mention the fact that Roswell was redistricted into 3 different congressional districts, which basically just makes their votes almost worth nothing. And not to mention all that was happening. That was a real opportunity for them to say, no, we like Southeast New Mexico. We like what they do for the state. We appreciate their culture. And none of that was said by any leadership or any lawmakers that are in Santa Fe that have any clout or any decision-making ability.
Yeah, I can't argue with any of that. I guess the best I can do is put a name to it. And I had an article, an op-ed that ran in papers across the state, and you can gauge to an extent how people react generally to the kinds of articles that you write when you get phone calls and emails back talking about, I thought that was really great or interesting, or the take you had. Um, I I learned about something called the Curley Effect recently, Curley effect, and it has nothing to do with Larry or Moe, but it actually deals with a Boston mayor in the 40s and 50s who essentially caused long-term economic stagnation in his city with his policies, and shaped the electorate by chasing out and rhetorically attacking, or sometimes attacking the funding of people who disagreed with his take on things. So basically, he enacted crony capitalism, bad policies, and then, kind of chased out of town anybody who didn't agree with what he was doing. And that's kind of, I believe, something that's very much happening in New Mexico. The problem, as Mimi Stewart said, if you don't like New Mexico's policies, feel free to leave. Well, that is the Curley effect in effect. The idea that people can leave, and those are people who are voting differently and on different sides of that cultural divide. That is something that it seems that New Mexico's politicians, at least the far blue Democrats, are really happy about, because all they're doing is losing votes of people who they disagree with. Obviously, the secession issue and actually splitting off those counties would cost the state money. And unfortunately, as you rightly point out, and I hadn't really thought of that before I talked to you, that is obviously uh, a much different equation if you take those billions of dollars worth of oil and gas and send them elsewhere. keep them in Lea and Eddy County or move them to Texas. And I've said that if Southeast New Mexico is serious about this, they're going to have to put up some billions of dollars, and I mean billions with a B, over time, basically to bribe the rest of the state of New Mexico, the Santa Fe folks, to allow them to leave. That is a honest to goodness fact that if this is to ever happen, there will have to be significant payments made for permission to leave. Kind of an exit tax that's done by the United States in some instances when people renounce their citizenship. Now, one other question or component of all of this is that whole El Paso conversation. Now, I'm sure you've spent time in El Paso. I've spent a little time in El
Yeah.
Paso. I'm familiar with the culture of El Paso. I know that a lot of New Mexicans see El Paso as rightfully being a part of Texas that could be a part of New Mexico. And the idea, that somehow there would be a trade, that Lea and Eddy counties would leave to go to Texas and El Paso would come into New Mexico. Um, First and foremost, I don't know that the folks in El Paso would want to come to New Mexico. While it is a blue area of Texas, it is an economic dynamo by New Mexico standards. Not as big by Texas standards, because you've got Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin. You got big cities. So they are forgotten about a little bit in El Paso, but you would have to stick them on the same bad, broken economic policy regime as the rest of New Mexico, which is a gross receipts tax, which is high income tax, very business unfriendly regulations. I don't see the folks in El Paso jumping on board. Certainly not if you had a real public campaign where people were having to understand the impact of some of those economic policies. So uh, the fact is that New Mexico is poorly governed. It is economically stagnant. It is population stagnant. And the reality is that a lot of places, a lot of parts of New Mexico would do better if they simply had the policies of not just Texas, but Arizona or even Colorado.
Right.
And the powers that be in Santa Fe want nothing to do with acknowledging that, the contributions of Southeast New Mexico, et cetera. Unfortunately, they just cash the checks and kind of say, screw you.
So one of the questions I've gotten a lot down here, and I'm not sure I know the answer, and I'm not. Maybe you do, and if you don't, it's not a big deal, of course. But like, what we're talking about succession or annexation by Texas, but what is like the steps to actually do that is much more than just the local community voting for that, right? So I mean, there's a lot of steps related to that. Are you familiar with what the steps would be in order for that to happen?
Well, the first thing is that you would need the legislature to pass what amounts to a constitutional amendment, which is what the representatives introduced in the last session. I believe it was HJR 10. That is the singular obstacle, simply put, because there's no interest in the legislature in letting go of Southeast New Mexico and the money that it provides. So, I would say the chances of that, are slim to none and slim left town. Uh, that is by itself a huge obstacle. But there's a process laid out in the amendment. It involves local governments. I think there's even a referendum locally that would be put on the ballot. Uh, you could obviously become independent, but then Congress would inevitably want to weigh in. And then if you wanted to move over to Texas, then Texas's government would have to weigh in as well. And I really don't think any of this is highly relevant, because the first step is the hardest step. The idea that somehow you get the legislature of New Mexico to go along with this, it's simply very unlikely, very, very unlikely.
So one of the crux of this is the idea of the amount of tax dollars that we send to the state of New Mexico every year, Eddy and Lea County specifically, which really segues right into the next segment on, I think you mentioned, and I read it as well, it was a Wallet Hub story that showed that New Mexico's return on investment, or ROI, as most people are aware of it, is the worst in the country for the amount of tax dollars that we send.
Yeah, and it's not really even close. In fact, if you look at the Wallet Hub report, which I recommend, I mean, I try to do a very good job of highlighting some of the data. So not every report from Wallet Hub or other kind of state rankings is great, but here's how they break things down on the Wallet Hub report: education, health, safety, economy, infrastructure, and pollution. Those are the five broad metrics of what you're getting from government. And then basically you are, the way they do it is they then rank all the states by taxes paid. And New Mexico comes in very, very badly in those because, just if we were a low tax state, our education system's the worst in the country. Our healthcare sector's in shambles, and maybe finally moving in a positive direction just after this legislative session. Our safety, we know that our public safety is a real issue, especially in our major cities. Our economy is growing, but it's heavily, heavily dependent on oil and gas. And then infrastructure. We've talked about the road situation. Our pollution is okay as a state, but those metrics are not very good. And then you throw into the fact that we're very heavily taxed once you factor in oil and gas uh, revenue that is brought in. And basically, the gist of it is they have a bubble chart based on an XY axis with government services and total taxes per capita. New Mexico is barely on the chart. We are at the far right corner, which is the very worst place you can be, which is a high tax, bad service state. We vastly overtake California even in that area, which is the second worst state in the country. Uh, the most effective state, the best state with high quality government services and low taxes is New Hampshire. They have no sales tax, they have no income tax, and yet their public services rank better than any other state, including by far and away New Mexico at the opposite end. The other two best performing states are Florida and South Dakota, neither of which have an income tax. They're both low tax states. So what am I getting at here ultimately? Government doesn't do a very good job of fulfilling the so-called services that it pays for. I don't think you and I would argue at all that if you want something done in most areas, you don't go to government first. You go to the private sector, and generally speaking, they will do the job at a much lower price than going through governments, whether it's paving a road, delivering something, et cetera, unless it's subsidized in some way, shape, or form, which is the only way that government can make that work. So our return on investment stinks in New Mexico, and we have a low return on investment relative to all of our neighbors, where Arizona's 14th best, Utah's 9th best, Colorado's 11th best, Texas is 13th best, Oklahoma's 28th best, and here we are in New Mexico, dead last. That is not good country to be in, good territory to be in. And it highlights yet again why not just people are leaving, our population is stagnant, but even entire counties are saying this state is not governed well. We're looking for options.
Yeah, it's surprising to me when you look at all the stats of the surrounding states surrounding New Mexico that we don't take any lessons from them at all. We don't, like, let's take a model that is working for other states and then also make it for New Mexico. There's not a single lesson that we take from any of those states. And those states, by comparison to New Mexico, are thriving. And I think they're thriving compared to the rest of the country as well.
Yeah, we're in the most competitive area of our country. There's no question that this is a fast growing place here in the southwestern part of our country. And the rates of income, for example, in Arizona is just 2.5%. Ours is 5.9%. Utah, very good business structure, right to work, low taxes. Colorado has the Taxpayers Bill of Rights. It's a blue state. They are suffering some effects from long-term blue state domination, but Colorado still has a growing population and a much smaller government than we do overall. Texas, no income tax, right to work, very pro-business culture. All of these states have different flaws and problems that you can also tout as drawbacks relative to their neighbors or other states, but they all have something that draws people in. And New Mexico, simply put, from a governance perspective, has nothing that says, oh, this state is doing X, Y, and Z correct. Very, very few areas of governance are done well at the state level here in New Mexico.
Yeah. So let's get on to our final topic, because it's so easy to talk about the New Mexico succession to Texas if that was to ever happen. That's just such a good topic to talk about, even though there's really no remote reality for it. But you always talk to us about school choice, and you talk to us about the importance that your organization feels about school choice. And you mentioned something before we started recording about the federal school choice tax credit, which I have no familiarity with at all. And so I'm curious what you wanted to say about that and where we can go with that.
Yeah, well, not only can I tell you about it, I will enlist you and hopefully your listeners in promoting and encouraging on this. So the big, beautiful bill passed in Washington approximately a year ago. This bill contains numerous different provisions addressing a lot of tax questions, et cetera. But one of the things that was in that bill is a $1,700 tax credit for people like yourself, myself, who have tax burdens to the federal government, that we could take a one-for-one tax credit, so $17 that goes to a school choice organization as opposed to the federal government. And that money then is donated to a scholarship organization that provides scholarships at the K-12 level for kids in those families to choose the education that they prefer. Or it could be, and these are for lower income young people, but there's also tutoring services and other things that for even public schools and charter schools, those folks can benefit from as well. So it's a very robust, multifaceted in its use tax credit. But from somebody like myself who supports educational choice and the idea of parents being able to send their kids where they want to, not have them stuck in a school that's failing them, this is the big thing. And part of the compromise of that provision was that the governors of the respective states get to choose whether they participate in the program. By that, will those tax credit dollars come to your state, or will they flow to other states? So we'll be able to take that tax credit one way or the other, but will New Mexico kids be able to benefit from those $1,700 credits? The governor immediately upon passage said, I don't want to do this. And she said, no. Jared Polis of Colorado, a progressive Democrat himself, said, heck yeah, why would I let that money sit on the table? I'm going to have Colorado participate. The deadline is the end of this year. So when the governor leaves office, we'll know whether New Mexico's in or out. Future governors could put us in, but they probably would have to wait through the 2027 calendar year to do that. Not surprising to you, me, or anybody else, recently the teachers unions came out and said, this was from a woman named Whitney Holland, president of the American Federation of Teachers. She said that this would be a disastrous program, and it would disenfranchise students in rural New Mexico communities that lack school choice options. Now, That is downright funny, because the idea that you're disenfranchising people in rural areas if they don't have uh, private schools, non-public schools in their area, that's ridiculous, first and foremost. Schools may develop, and if you're living in a rural area and you suddenly have the opportunity to send your kid to a better school, you may take advantage of that and find creative ways to do that. But you're, by not having a choice that you don't already have, it's hard to call anything revolving around this tax credit, uh, devastating or anything. Simply put, this is money that will become available starting next year. Does New Mexico take advantage of it, or do we simply follow the unions and the progressive mindset which we have when it comes to education, that's gotten us to 52nd in the country in educational performance? So I think it's pretty simple. Rebecca Dow, state rep, a Republican, recently sent a letter to the governor urging her to include New Mexico in the program. We've also worked with the Catholic archbishops of New Mexico, who sent a letter also advocating. As you can imagine, Catholic schools are a big portion of the student population in non-public schools in New Mexico. And by the way, if Catholic schools were independent districts uh, in the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, they'd be the highest performing school district of all. So if you took Catholic schools across the country and just put them up as a district, they would be the number one performing district or state in the country.
That's
And so, yeah, I encourage you and others through our errorsoфenchantment.com post. You can go down to the bottom. You can go to the governor's page where you contact her, send her an email, and it doesn't have to be anything complicated. Just simply say, hey, I hope you'll support this school choice tax credit at the federal level that could really help a lot of New Mexico families. And we'll see. We'll know soon enough.
All right, one more question for you related to school choice. What do you have a percentage? What is the likelihood that New Mexico will participate in this federal school choice tax credit program?
Ooh, I don't have a percentage, but I think it's better than it was when she originally came out and said no. And then Jared Polis jumped in and she's kind of relented. There have been some articles saying that she's considering it. She wants to see what the regulations look like before she makes a decision. I think we're having a positive impact here. We're moving the needle in the right direction. It is true that the federal regulations around this particular program have not been finalized yet. Obviously, that needs to happen sometime before the end of the year in order to give the governors an idea of what exactly this all entails. But the gist of it is, as I said, there could be some rules and regulations. For example, something that we would really be frustrated by is if the regulations allow states to just pick and choose what they want to accept within this program. For example, allowing the tutoring fees to be covered with the scholarship, but not private school tuition. If that is a loophole or something that is allowed in the federal regulation, that would make this very unattractive to anybody who cares about real education performance and outcomes in New Mexico. But it might be what the unions are looking for, might be what the governor's looking for as a stop to the unions to essentially, uh, not allow kids in New Mexico to have the option that works for them and not to have that choice, which would be very disappointing. But I've been disappointed by this governor many times in the past, so I wouldn't be shocked if she tried that. But hopefully the federal regulations prohibit that, and the governor still is willing to participate. That is very much up in the air, though. So I think it's worth reaching out and saying, "Hey, Governor Lujan Grisham, I support this program and allowing New Mexicans to participate and receive these scholarships, and it should be available for true school choice in the state of New Mexico.
I could see that being a real catalyst for community members to start a private school if the community does not have one. You know what I mean? I could see that being a real opportunity for them. Paul, I think we're going to have to consider trying to make the next, every time you come on, be an hour long instead of just the 30 minutes that I've allotted in the local programming. You just have too much great stuff to say and it's too entertaining. But that is all the time we have today. So I'd love to give you the final word, of course, and then also plug everywhere where people can read all the information that you're sharing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Johnny. Like I said, go to heirsofenchantment.com. The post I have up is continuing the push for federal school choice tax credits. And there's a map of the 28 states that are participating. There's a link at the bottom of that post that you can go to the page to weigh in with the governor. Go to heirsofenchantment.com, go to riograndefoundation.org, go to tippingpointnewmexico.com, or Tipping Point NM, I should say, and that's our podcast. I've got several great episodes. I've got both of the CD2 candidates for Congress, Cunningham and Orozco. I recently sat down with Ramona Goolsbee for Secretary of State. A lot of interesting conversations happening there as well. So appreciate the time, Johnny. And an hour, I can talk about this stuff for as long as people will listen.
Yeah, there's no question. You're always one of our more popular segments. So Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, thank you very much, sir, for coming on.
Thank you. Bye.
You're listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889.